The little boy stood at the center of the courtroom, eyes wide, voice trembling. "He touched me," he said, pointing straight at the royal guard in the defendant's box. Gasps rippled through the gallery, cameras clicked, reporters leaned forward. And the man they were all staring at, Corporal Ezra Flint, didn't flinch. No lawyer, no support, just his uniform. And the weight of the accusation. So what did the boy really mean? And what happened when someone finally asked the right question? Before we show you what happened next, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. We read every single one. Now, let's get into it. Corporal Ezra Flint stood in Southwark Crown Court on a Tuesday morning that felt heavier than lead. Outside, London's sky rested down like wet concrete, matching the suffocating atmosphere inside the packed courtroom. 20 years he'd worn the uniform, through ceremonial duties, foreign deployments, and countless moments when children's faces lit up at the sight of his towering bearskin hat. Now that same uniform felt like a target painted on his back. The scarlet tunic that once represented honor now drew suspicious stares from every corner of the gallery. Journalists clutched their notepads like weapons, service members sat rigid with embarrassment, and civilians whispered behind cupped hands. The golden buttons that had gleamed under palace sunshine looked dull under the harsh courtroom fluorescence. His ceremonial gloves lay folded on the defendant's table, hands that had never harmed a soul now accused of the unthinkable. What struck everyone most wasn't his nervousness or his protestations of innocence. It was his stillness. Ezra Flint sat as motionless as if he were back at his post outside Buckingham Palace, chin up, eyes forward, waiting for his relief to arrive, except this time relief might never come. "Corporal Flint," the clerk's voice echoed off the oak-panelled walls, "you stand charged under Section 4A of the Sexual Offences Act, allegations of abuse against a minor under the age of 12. A ripple of movement passed through the gallery like wind through wheat. Even the other guards in attendance, recognizable by their perfect posture and the way they avoided eye contact, shifted uncomfortably. These were men who had served alongside Flint, shared barracks with him, trusted him with their backs during overseas tours. Now they sat 3 rows behind him, close enough to show solidarity, but far enough to avoid guilt by association. Near the prosecution table sat a man who didn't quite fit. While everyone else wore court-appropriate formal wear, he sported a navy jacket that couldn't quite hide the outline of body armour beneath. His haircut screamed military, but his presence felt wrong, too protective, too controlling of the small figure beside him. Sergeant Colin Dwire. That's what his identification said, though he hadn't been formally introduced to the court. Metropolitan Police, assigned as a victim liaison specialist. He kept one hand constantly on the shoulder of the boy beside him, the alleged victim, whose testimony would determine Flint's fate. Flint's eyes found Dwire the moment he'd entered the courtroom, and something flickered in his memory. Not recognition exactly, but the nagging sensation of a face that belonged somewhere else. Somewhere sun-baked and dangerous, the feeling you get when you smell smoke but can't locate the fire. The boy, meanwhile, sat pressed between his anxious mother and Dwyer's imposing presence. No older than 9, pale and fragile in his pressed school uniform, he stared at his shoes while whispered conversations swirled around him. Every few moments, Dwire would lean down to murmur something in his ear, and the child would nod without lifting his head. "All rise." The judge entered with the measured pace of a man who had seen every possible variation of human failing. As the court settled, he adjusted his spectacles and reviewed the file before him, with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the next few hours would either restore a man's honour or destroy it completely. "Corporal Flint," the judge said, his voice carrying easily through the hushed chamber, "I see you've declined legal representation." Flint rose smoothly, his military bearing intact, despite everything crumbling around him. "I have, Your Honour." "Do you understand the gravity of these charges and the consequences of representing yourself? "Yes, sir, I do." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the gallery. Even hardened criminals rarely faced such serious allegations without legal counsel, yet here stood a man whose life hung in the balance, armed with nothing but his word and 20 years of military discipline. The Crown Prosecutor rose, and her voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "Members of the jury, what you will hear today challenges everything we believe about trust and protection. This defendant wore the uniform of the Queen's Guard, a symbol of honour, duty and safety. Parents point to men like him and tell their children, 'See, there are still good people in the world.'" She paced slowly before the jury, letting her words sink in. But what happens when that symbol of protection becomes the source of fear? When the gentle giant who kneels to speak with children behind the palace barriers uses that trust for unspeakable purposes? Several jurors leaned forward, caught in the web she was weaving. You will hear testimony that this man's interactions with children weren't random acts of kindness. They were calculated grooming behaviours. That his reputation for breaking protocol to comfort young visitors wasn't about compassion, it was about access. She turned toward Flint, her gaze laser-focused. "The evidence will show that Corporal Flint used his position, his uniform, and the trust it represents to gain access to a vulnerable child. And when that child finally found the courage to speak, we listened." The silence that followed felt like a held breath. A juror in the front row shifted uncomfortably, clearly moved by the prosecutor's words. Another crossed her arms, skepticism written across her face. From the gallery, a whispered exchange. "If he's guilty, why no lawyer?" Guilty men hire expensive barristers. Innocent ones sometimes think the truth is enough. Then the judge turned to Flint. "You may respond now or reserve your opening statement." Flint stood, and something shifted in the room's energy. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had faced down insurgents in Afghanistan and stood guard during terrorist threats at home. "Your Honour, I've worn this uniform for nearly 2 decades. I've stood in the scorching heat of Kandahar and the freezing rain of London. I've protected dignitaries who barely acknowledged my existence and comforted tourists who treated me like a living statue. Through all of it, I've carried one simple truth. This uniform represents something bigger than myself." He looked directly at the jury, his eyes steady and clear. "Yes, I've spoken to children. Yes, I've bent the rules to make a sick child smile, or to help a shy little girl get a better view of the ceremony. Because sometimes the most important duty isn't following protocol, it's remembering why we serve in the first place." His voice never wavered, never rose in anger or desperation. "But I have never, not once, betrayed the trust that comes with this uniform. I have never harmed a child, and I never will." He sat down to absolute silence. No rustling papers, no whispered comments, no movement at all, just the weight of words hanging in the air. From somewhere in the gallery, a voice barely above a whisper. "He's either telling the truth, or he's the best liar I've ever seen." The first witness called was Sergeant Lyndon Hart, Coldstream Guards. As he walked to the stand, his polished boots clicking against the courtroom floor, several guards in the gallery straightened. Hart was respected, known for his integrity and his loyalty to his brothers in arms. His testimony could make or break Flint's defence. After being sworn in, Hart faced the prosecutor with the same steady gaze he'd used during countless patrols. "How long have you known the defendant?" "Ezra and I enlisted on the same day, 18 years ago," Hart replied. "We've served together at Windsor, Buckingham Palace, and overseas. I've shared barracks with him, stood guard beside him, and trusted him with my life more times than I can count." "And how would you characterize his interactions with children?" Hart's jaw tightened slightly. "Children were drawn to him. It's not uncommon, the uniform, the ceremony, it captures their imagination. But Ezra was different. He didn't just tolerate their curiosity, He embraced it. "Can you give us an example?" "Dozens," Hart replied without hesitation. "There was the little girl who dropped her teddy bear during the ceremony. Protocol says we don't break formation for anything. Ezra waited until the formal inspection was complete, then walked over and placed it back in her hands. Made her whole day." The prosecutor's eyebrow arched. "And that didn't concern you? A grown man focusing so much attention on children?" "No," Hart said firmly, "because I've seen predators in action during our overseas deployments. They operate through manipulation, isolation, fear. Ezra did the opposite. Everything he did was public, witnessed by parents, recorded by tourists. He brought joy, not fear." "But let's talk about a more specific incident. There was a boy named Liam," Hart said, his voice softening with memory. 8 years old, terminal cancer. His mother had written through a charity, asking if he could see the changing of the guard one more time before he cleared his throat. The family was positioned behind the barriers, but Liam couldn't see properly from his wheelchair. The courtroom had gone completely still. Even the prosecutors seemed caught in the story. So Ezra stepped out of formation. Didn't break posture, just repositioned himself so he could walk beside that wheelchair for the entire 15-minute ceremony. No orders to do it, no clearance from command. He just saw a dying child who wanted to watch the guards march, and he made sure it happened. Was this a breach of protocol? Technically, yes. So you're saying the defendant has a history of breaking rules when it comes to children? Hart's eyes flashed. I'm saying he has a history of choosing humanity over bureaucracy. Liam passed away 2 weeks later. His mother sent a letter saying that was the last time she saw her son truly smile. The prosecutor pressed on, sensing an opening. But given the charges before us today, doesn't this pattern of rule-breaking concerning children seem problematic? The question hung in the air like poison gas. Hart looked at Flint, then back at the prosecutor. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute conviction. "No, it makes the accusations impossible to believe because I've seen Ezra Flint's heart. I've watched him mourn for children he met for 5 minutes, celebrate their small victories like they were his own grandchildren. The man who walked beside Liam's wheelchair isn't capable of what you're suggesting." But then the prosecutor delivered her killing blow. "Sergeant Hart, regardless of your personal feelings, if these allegations were proven true, would it change your opinion of the defendant?" Hart's shoulders sagged slightly. "If they were true, then I would have been wrong about everything I thought I knew about him. But that's the thing about betrayal, isn't it? If it's real, it always comes as a shock." As Hart stepped down from the witness stand, he passed close to Flint's table. Without a word, he placed a pair of white ceremonial gloves on the ledge, his spare set. A silent gesture between guards that said more than any speech, "I still remember who you were before all this." Flint stared at those gloves as if they were a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. During the recess, Flint remained seated while chaos swirled around him. Reporters rushed out to file updates, lawyers huddled in urgent conferences, and court officers managed the crowd flow. But Flint's attention was fixed on one person, Sergeant Dwire. A junior barrister from the prosecution team approached Dwire near the water fountain. "The judge wants to review your credentials again. Something about military service records?" Dwyer's response was too quiet to hear, but his body language shifted, shoulders tensing, eyes darting toward the exits. "Just routine verification," he said loudly enough for others to hear. "I'll fetch the documents from my car." But Flint noticed he didn't head toward the parking garage. Instead, Dwire guided the boy and his mother toward a side corridor, away from the main flow of people. "Jamie's getting overwhelmed," Dwire told the mother. "Perhaps we should find somewhere quieter for him to collect himself before his testimony." The man hadn't left the boy's side since the hearing began. Every movement was controlled, every whispered conversation carefully managed. The way he positioned himself between the child and anyone who might approach. The way his hand never quite left the boy's shoulder. It felt less like protection and more like possession. There was something familiar about Dwire's profile, the way he carried himself, the faded scar behind his left ear. As Flint watched, memory began to crystallize like salt from seawater. Afghanistan, 2012. Forward Operating Base Chapman. Flint had been part of a joint operation with Intelligence Corps personnel, including a sergeant who'd been investigating local networks of collaboration and resistance. Until the day 2 Afghan interpreters were found with morphine vials, military-grade opiates that should have been locked in medical supplies. The investigating sergeant had disappeared 48 hours later. Official story: medical discharge due to combat stress. Unofficial whispers: involvement in a black market drug ring that was selling coalition medical supplies to local dealers. Nothing was ever proven, and the whole affair was buried under operational security. The sergeant's name had been Colin Dwire. Flint's blood ran cold as the pieces fell into place. The same man who had fled Afghanistan under a cloud of suspicion was now sitting beside the prosecution's star witness, whispering instructions into the ear of a terrified child. When court reconvened, Flint requested a private word with the judge. The gallery was cleared, leaving only essential court personnel. "Your Honour, I need to raise a concern about the prosecution's victim liaison." The judge frowned. "Elaborate." Sergeant Dwire served in Afghanistan. He was dishonourably discharged under circumstances involving suspected theft of controlled substances. I was there when it happened. The judge leaned forward. "That's a serious allegation, Mr. Flint. Do you have proof?" The incident involved 2 Afghan interpreters found with morphine vials, military-grade opiates stolen from medical supplies. Dwire was the investigating officer who should have secured those drugs. When questions arose about his handling of evidence, he disappeared from base. Official discharge came 3 days later. "And you're telling me this why?" "Because that man has been controlling every aspect of this child's testimony since day one. If I'm right about his background, he has both the motive and the means to fabricate this entire case." The judge made a note. "I want his service records pulled immediately. Full background check, not just the surface credentials the prosecution provided." He looked directly at Flint. "If you're wrong about this, then I'll accept whatever consequences come with making false accusations," Flint replied steadily. "But I'm not wrong." The judge went very still. "I'll look into this immediately. Return to your seat." When court reconvened 20 minutes later, a subtle but significant change had occurred. Dwire was no longer sitting beside the boy. Instead, a court officer had taken his place, and the prosecution looked distinctly uncomfortable. The lead prosecutor approached the bench for a sidebar. Her whispered words were urgent. "Your Honour, our liaison has been temporarily reassigned. We request a brief adjournment to—" "Denied," the judge said curtly. "We proceed as scheduled." As she returned to her table, the prosecutor's confidence had visibly shaken. The boy's mother looked confused, glancing around for Dwire. "Where did the officer go?" she asked a court clerk. "He said he'd be here for Jamie." "The court calls its final witness," the clerk announced. "Master A, under protected identity provisions." The boy who walked to the witness stand looked even smaller than before. His school shoes didn't reach the footrest, and his hands trembled as he was sworn in. The entire courtroom seemed to lean forward, as if the collective weight of their attention might crush him. The prosecutor approached gently. "I know this is difficult, sweetheart. Just tell us what happened." The boy glanced around the courtroom with wide, frightened eyes. When his gaze found the spot where Dwire had been sitting, now conspicuously empty, something shifted in his expression. "Can you tell us who this man is?" the prosecutor asked, gesturing toward Flint. He's the guard," the boy whispered. And did he ever touch you inappropriately? The question hung in the air like a blade. The boy looked down at his hands, then back up at the empty chair where Dwire had been sitting. His bottom lip began to tremble. He told me, the boy's voice cracked. Take your time, the judge said kindly. But instead of looking at the prosecutor or the judge, the boy turned his gaze to Flint. And Flint, breaking every rule of courtroom protocol, looked directly back at him. Not with desperation or pleading, but with the same calm, steady presence he brought to everything else. That look lasted only seconds, but it seemed to give the boy strength. He told me to say it, the boy said suddenly, his voice clearer now. The courtroom erupted in confused murmurs. Who told you to say what? The prosecutor asked, her confidence wavering. The boy raised a shaking hand and pointed, not at Flint, but at the empty chair where Dwire had been sitting. That man, the policeman, he told me to say that the guard hurt me, but he didn't. The guard never hurt me. The courtroom erupted. Reporters lunged for their phones, the jury gasped in unison, and the prosecution table descended into chaos. But through it all, the boy kept talking, his voice gaining strength with each word. He said if I didn't say it, my mum would go to jail. He said nobody would believe me if I told the truth. He said the guard was bad and had to be punished. But he wasn't bad. He never even talked to me. Objection! The prosecutor shot up. Your Honour, this child is clearly confused, traumatized. Overruled, the judge said sharply. The witness will continue. The boy wiped his nose with his sleeve. The policeman came to our house lots of times. He showed me pictures of the guard and made me practice saying things. When I said I didn't want to, he got really angry. He said my mum owed money to bad people, and if I didn't help, they'd hurt her. The boy's mother stood up in the gallery, her face white with shock. Jamie, is that true? About the money? Mum, the boy said, looking directly at her for the first time. I'm sorry I lied. I was so scared. The judge's gavel cracked like thunder. Order! Order in this court! When the chaos subsided, the judge leaned forward. Son, are you saying that someone coached you to lie about Corporal Flint? The boy nodded, tears streaming down his face. I didn't want to lie. I was scared. The policeman said terrible things would happen if I didn't do what he said. The prosecutor sat down heavily, her case crumbling around her. From the gallery came the sound of someone sobbing, the boy's mother, realizing that her child had been manipulated by the very person meant to protect him. The judge's voice cut through the noise like steel. Where is Sergeant Dwire? Your Honour, a court officer reported, he left the building during recess and hasn't responded to radio contact. Issue a warrant for his immediate arrest. Within an hour, the truth began to emerge. Dwyer's credentials as a police liaison had been forged. His real record showed the Afghanistan discharge, followed by a string of minor cons and attempts to insert himself into high-profile cases. He had targeted this family specifically, using the mother's trust and the child's innocence to craft an elaborate revenge plot against the military system that had expelled him. A court clerk approached the judge with a folder of documents. Your Honour, we've received the full military service record you requested. There are significant discrepancies. The prosecutor stood, clearly flustered. Your Honour, we were provided with standard credentials through proper channels. If there's been some administrative error... This goes beyond administrative error, the judge said grimly, scanning the documents. The person you've been working with appears to have fabricated his entire professional identity. From the gallery, the boy's mother stood up, her voice shaking. I don't understand. Sergeant Dwire said he was helping us. He said he'd make sure justice was done. The court officer beside her spoke gently. Ma'am, it appears you and your son were manipulated by someone with false credentials and malicious intent. When the judge returned to deliver his ruling, Flint stood at attention one final time. Corporal Ezra Flint, the judge said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. In light of the revelations regarding witness tampering and the complete breakdown of credible testimony, all charges against you are hereby dismissed with prejudice. The gavel fell with finality. For a moment, no one moved. Then a single voice from the gallery, one of the guards in attendance, called out, "Welcome home, brother!" The sound that followed wasn't applause exactly, but something deeper. The rustle of people standing, the murmur of voices saying finally and justice and about time. From the gallery, one of the guards called out, "Bloody well done, Ezra!" Another voice, older and more refined, "The regiment's proud of you, son." But the most powerful moment came when the boy's mother approached Flint as he gathered his things. Her eyes were red with tears, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I believed him. He seemed so professional, so concerned about Jamie. I thought we were doing the right thing." Flint looked at her with the same steady compassion he'd shown throughout the trial. "You were protecting your son, Ma'am. That's what mothers do. No apology needed." "But we nearly ruined your life." "You were both victims," Flint said firmly. "The only person responsible for this is the man who manipulated you." The woman broke down completely then, and Flint did something that surprised everyone watching. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder, the same gesture of comfort he'd offered countless tourists and their children over the years. But Flint himself showed no triumph, no relief, no joy. He simply nodded to the judge, gathered his ceremonial gloves from the table, and walked toward the exit with the same measured pace he'd maintained throughout the entire ordeal. Outside the courthouse, the London drizzle had turned into proper rain. Reporters thrust microphones toward Flint as he descended the steps, shouting questions over each other. "How does it feel to be vindicated? Will you return to duty? Do you blame the system that failed you? Corporal Flint, do you have anything to say to the boy who falsely accused you?" That question made Flint pause for the first time. He turned toward the reporter, a young woman with determined eyes. "That child," he said quietly, "is a victim too. He showed more courage in that courtroom than most adults show in a lifetime. I hope he can heal from what was done to him." Another reporter pushed forward. "What about Sergeant Dwire? Did you suspect him from the beginning?" "I suspected something was wrong," Flint replied, "but I trusted the system to find the truth. Sometimes that's all you can do." But Flint didn't linger for more questions. He simply walked through the crowd as if it weren't there. Halfway down the steps, a familiar figure stepped out of the rain. Sergeant Hart, holding an umbrella and wearing a slight smile. "Thought you might need an escort," Hart said simply. Flint nodded, accepting the shelter. As they walked away together, two guards in the rain, neither spoke. Some things didn't need words. 3 days later, a small item appeared in the court records. Colin Dwire had been arrested attempting to board a flight to Spain with a false passport. Among his possessions were detailed files on several other military personnel, suggesting that Flint hadn't been his only target. Detective Inspector Sarah Chen, who led the investigation into Dwyer's activities, later told reporters, "This man had been systematically targeting military families for months. He would identify vulnerable situations, single mothers, families with financial troubles, and exploit them to pursue personal vendettas against service members." She paused, choosing her words carefully. What's remarkable is that Corporal Flint's case was the first where someone had the knowledge and courage to expose him. Without that intervention, Dwire would likely have continued destroying innocent lives. The boy and his mother, meanwhile, had been connected with proper victim support services to help them recover from the trauma of Dwyer's manipulation. The child would need time to heal from being used as a weapon against an innocent man, but with proper care, children are remarkably resilient. During one of their counselling sessions, the boy asked his therapist, "Do you think the guard man hates me for lying about him?" The therapist, who had been briefed on the case, smiled gently. "What do you think, Jamie? From what you saw of him in court, What kind of person did he seem to be? Nice, the boy said quietly. Even when everyone was being mean to him, he was still nice. As for Corporal Ezra Flint, he returned to his post outside Buckingham Palace the following week. The crowds were larger than usual. Word had spread about the guard who had faced down false accusations with dignity and silence. Children still approached the barriers, and their parents still pointed at his towering figure with respect. On his first day back, a small girl in a pink coat approached the barrier with her father. She looked up at Flint with wide eyes and whispered something to her dad. "Go ahead," the father encouraged. "He won't bite." The girl stepped forward and held up a drawing, crayon figures of a guard and a little stick person holding hands. "Thank you for being brave," she said in a tiny voice. Flint knelt carefully, accepting the drawing with the same precision he'd shown throughout his ordeal. "Thank you, miss. That's very kind." As he stood, the girl's father extended his hand. "James Morrison, I was in the gallery during your trial. Thought you should know. Not everyone believed the lies." Flint shook his hand firmly. "I appreciate that, sir." "Takes real character to stand alone like that," Morrison continued. "My daughter wanted to draw that picture because she said you looked sad on the news. Kids see things differently sometimes." But something had changed. When Flint knelt to speak with a shy little girl, or helped a boy get a better view of the ceremony, there was an added gentleness in his movements. Not because he was more careful now, but because he understood more deeply than ever what trust meant, and how precious it was when given freely. The white gloves Hart had given him during the trial? Flint wore them every day. A reminder that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with weapons, but with the simple determination to remain who you are when everything tries to convince you otherwise. What would you do if your life's work was turned against you? If the very symbol of your honor became the tool of your destruction? And what about that little boy? Would you have had the courage to tell the truth when powerful adults demanded you lie? Sometimes the strongest among us aren't those who fight back, but those who stand still and let the truth find its way to the surface. If this story reminded you that character is what you do when no one is watching, and integrity is what you maintain when everyone is, then hit that like button. Make sure you're subscribed and ring the notification bell so you never miss our daily Royal Guard stories. Each one proves that real strength isn't about the uniform you wear, but the person you choose to be inside it. Share this with someone who needs to remember that truth doesn't need a defense attorney. It just needs time. Your next story is waiting. Click now and we'll see you tomorrow.